Canada's auto industry is navigating one of the most paradoxical moments in its manufacturing history. Despite unprecedented trade tensions with its largest market, historic tariff impositions, and widespread predictions of industrial collapse, the sector is quietly booming, and Washington seems genuinely caught off guard by what Canada is doing about it. This isn't just a story about tariffs or trade disputes. It's about how one country is using economic crisis to fundamentally reposition itself in the global automotive order and the strategic implications rippling outward from that decision. Let's start with what's actually happening on the ground. Through 2024 and into 2025, Canada's auto market has been firing on cylinders in ways that shouldn't be possible given the external pressures. The industry recorded 1.86 million vehicle sales in 2024, up 8% year over year and marking the highest annual sales total since 2019, when Canada hit 1.91 million units. Think about that timing. The tariff announcement didn't come until March of 2025, so we're talking about momentum that built through 2024 despite knowing what was coming. Scotiabank predicted even stronger performance for 2025, with estimates of 1.80 million units. This steady growth signals something deeper than just cyclical recovery. It points to an industry that's benefiting from pent-up demand, improving supply chains after years of shortage-induced chaos, and genuine consumer appetite. The real anomaly isn't in the domestic market, though. It's in where the growth is concentrated and what it represents. Canada's automotive sector contributed $16.8 billion to GDP in 2024. Directly, the industry employs just over 125,000 people, but when you account for the aftermarket services, dealership networks, and supply chain integration, the figure climbs to approximately 427,000 jobs. That's not trivial for an economy Canada's size. 5 original equipment manufacturers, Ford, General Motors, Honda, Stellantis, and Toyota, assembled more than 1.31 million light-duty vehicles at Canadian plants last year. These operations are fed by a vibrant ecosystem of nearly 700 parts suppliers, including major Tier 1 anchoring firms like Martin-Rea, Linamar, and Magna. This isn't a hollowed-out industrial sector. This is sophisticated integrated manufacturing infrastructure. Now, here's where the boom becomes genuinely interesting: zero-emission vehicles. In the second quarter of 2024, ZEV registrations hit a record 13.4% market share in Canada, up from 12.5% in the first quarter. By comparison, the United States sat at just 10% ZEV penetration. Canada is leading the charge on electrification. Battery electric vehicles specifically hit 9.9% adoption in Q2 2024, up from 9.2% in the prior quarter. S&P Global Mobility predicted that Canadian ZEV adoption would hit 16% by the end of 2024. The momentum here isn't incidental to the story, it's central to it. This is an industry actively transitioning toward the technologies of the future, and Canada is outpacing its neighbor on that metric. Export performance tells a particularly important part of this story. In 2022, Canada exported $29.4 billion worth of vehicles, making it the 9th largest car exporter globally. Cars were Canada's second most exported product that year, behind only energy products. Even as the tariff regime took hold in 2025, Canadian automotive exports remained resilient. Through the first quarter of 2025, vehicle exports reached levels not seen since May 2019. This isn't a sector that's been shuttered. It's a sector that's weathering enormous external pressure and finding ways to maintain competitive momentum. But context matters. The boom exists in the shadow of profound structural threats. On March 4, 2025, the United States implemented 25% tariffs on Canadian goods broadly, with 10% on energy and potash. 12 days later, on March 12th, the U.S. imposed the same 25% rate on Canadian steel and aluminum. Then came April 3rd. The 25% tariff on Canadian automobiles came into effect, applying to the non-U.S. content portion of vehicles, with plans to extend similar rates to automobile parts by May 3rd. This wasn't theoretical. It was real. and it was massive. The Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association quantified the damage. Through 2025, manufacturers in Canada were exposed to approximately $5 billion in total tariff costs. To put that in perspective, you simply cannot maintain commercially viable automotive plants in Canada while absorbing that level of cost structure. Every analyst who examined this expected a dramatic contraction of the industry. It hasn't happened yet, but the structural damage is real and ongoing. Production declined 5.4% year over year in 2025, more severe than declines in the United States or Mexico. This means the pain is concentrated in Canada, and everyone knows it. What Washington apparently didn't anticipate was how Canada would respond. Instead of simply accepting integration into a North American supply chain controlled from Detroit and Washington, the Canadian government, particularly under Prime Minister Mark Carney's administration, launched what amounts to a comprehensive strategic repositioning. This is the part that's caught policymakers in Washington off guard. Let's trace through what's happened. Canada has massive reserves of critical minerals essential for battery manufacturing: lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite. Quebec alone accounts for roughly 38% of Canadian critical mineral production and sits on one of the world's largest lithium deposits at the Whabouchi mine. Over 50% of Canada's lithium projects are based in Quebec. These aren't speculative operations. Real capital is flowing into these sectors. The Canadian government partnered with E3 Lithium on a $27 million contribution toward a demonstration plant designed to produce up to 20,000 tons of battery-grade lithium annually. That's capacity that makes Canada a material participant in North American battery supply chains, not a peripheral player. Battery manufacturing is following the minerals. The government announced over $11 million in funding for 3 battery innovation projects led by Nano One Materials, EcoPro Lithium, and NanoXplore. These investments target everything from lithium iron phosphate production to ultra-high power lithium ion cell prototyping. Quebec hosts nearly a quarter of all battery firms in Canada already. This is infrastructure building in real time. Meanwhile, Magna and Linamar, 2 of Canada's most significant automotive suppliers, have been making substantial investments. Linamar announced $1 billion in new projects across Ontario in January 2025, specifically focused on hybrid and EV powertrain parts. Magna continues to expand its operations across multiple technological domains. These aren't reactions to the boom. These are bets on Canada's medium-term positioning in the automotive supply chain, made by sophisticated, globally engaged firms that understand where the industry is heading. But the really stunning strategic move came in how Canada approached the tariff crisis. Instead of simply capitulating to U.S. demands for renegotiated trade terms, the Canadian government initiated a deliberate diversification of trade relationships. In January 2026, Prime Minister Carney announced an objective to double non-U.S. exports over the next decade, with particular focus on Asia. 2 weeks before that, in a move that genuinely rattled Washington, Canada announced a strategic partnership with China, a global leader in EV manufacturing. Under this arrangement, Canada agreed to reduce its tariffs on Chinese EVs to 6.1% and allow a quota of 49,000 Chinese EVs into the Canadian market for 2026 in exchange for expanded access for Canadian canola oil to Chinese markets. This figure is expected to increase to 70,000 vehicles annually over the next 5 years. Measured against Canada's total EV market, this represents approximately 20% of EV and hybrid sales based on 2025 data, with projections suggesting it could reach 30% once the market fully absorbs the policy change. Now, from a narrow trade perspective, this makes obvious sense. Chinese automakers have dramatically reduced production costs for battery electric vehicles through scale and technological innovation. BYD, for instance, has become the world's largest EV manufacturer. For Canadian consumers, particularly those price-sensitive to the premium that North American EV pricing carries, Chinese imports mean more affordable access to electrified transportation. It also means relief from the supply constraints and inflation that have characterized the North American auto market. But geopolitically, this move signals something that Washington clearly didn't expect: Canada's willingness to pursue economic partnerships outside the North American sphere. The U.S. had spent 30 years building an integrated North American automotive supply chain that made Mexico and Canada economically dependent on American consumer demand and American production integration. That dependency translated into political influence. If you control the supply chain, you control the relationship. Canada is now deliberately introducing redundancy into its economic relationship, specifically to reduce that dependency. This was immediately followed by an announcement of a memorandum of understanding with South Korea to strengthen industrial collaboration on future mobility. South Korea is another major global player in battery technology and EV manufacturing. Again, we're seeing Canada build alternative relationships that can sustain its automotive sector, even if, or perhaps especially if, North American integration unravels. On February 5, 2026, Prime Minister Carney unveiled a comprehensive new automotive strategy. The language in these announcements matters because it reveals strategic intent. The government explicitly stated it would position Canada as a global leader in vehicle electrification, autonomous and self-driving technologies, and the battery supply chains that power mobility, not as a component of the North American supply chain, mind you, as a global leader. That's a fundamentally different ambition. The strategy included several key elements. First, a strengthened automotive remission framework designed to reward companies that produce and invest in Canada. Second, maintenance of counter tariffs on automobile imports from the United States, essentially saying Canada won't unilaterally disarm in the trade conflict. Third, leveraging new and existing trade agreements, including the EV arrangement with China, to catalyze investment. Fourth, strategic partnerships with South Korea and deepened collaboration with global automakers. Fifth, support for displaced workers through a new work-sharing grant program and a workforce alliance of industry, labor, and training partners. This is comprehensive industrial policy in the classical sense. It's not just responding to the tariff crisis. It's using the crisis as an opportunity to reshape Canada's position in the global automotive value chain. The Canadian government is explicitly accepting short-term pain, the production declines, the tariff costs, the employment disruptions, in service of medium-term structural repositioning. That's a choice that requires either desperation or confidence in an alternative future. Canada apparently has chosen confidence. What's caught Washington off guard is the combination of factors. First, Canada didn't collapse under tariff pressure the way many analysts predicted. Production declined, yes, but not catastrophically, and exports remained resilient. Second, Canada demonstrated willingness to diversify away from North American integration rather than negotiate desperately for a return to the status quo ante. Third, and perhaps most politically significant, Canada opened its domestic market to Chinese EVs in a way that directly challenges U.S. automotive industry dominance. And fourth, Canada is building alternative supply chain relationships with South Korea, China, and other partners in ways that explicitly reduce economic dependence on the North American sphere. For Washington, this creates a genuine problem. The Trump administration's tariff strategy was predicated on the idea that Canada and Mexico would quickly capitulate because they had no other options. They were locked into North American integration and would accept harsh terms to maintain access to U.S. markets. That's proven partially true for Mexico, where the government has taken a more accommodating stance. But Canada, under Carney's leadership, chose a different path. It chose to invest in its own competitive position, its own supply chains, and its own trade relationships. This matters enormously for the USMCA renegotiation, which is set to begin in the summer of 2026. The first review of the trade agreement coincides exactly with this period of maximum strategic repositioning. Washington likely went into this renegotiation expecting to dictate terms, to rewrite rules of origin on autos to favor U.S. production, to lock in higher North American content requirements, to eliminate the Chinese EV quota that Canada has established. Instead, it's negotiating with the Canadian government that has demonstrated credible alternatives to North American integration. We should be careful not to overstate this. Canada remains deeply integrated into North American supply chains. The industry absolutely depends on access to U.S. markets. 50% of Canadian vehicle content comes from the United States by value. In 2024, Canada imported nearly $30 billion in automotive parts from the United States. That integration isn't going away, but what's changed is the nature of Canada's negotiating position. Previously, that integration was presented as a necessity. Canada needed the U.S. market because there was nowhere else to go. Now, Canada can plausibly argue that it has options. It can source EVs and battery technology from China. It can build partnerships with South Korea. It can invest in critical minerals extraction and battery manufacturing that makes it valuable to global players, not just North American players. This is where the boom part of the story intersects with genuine industrial sophistication. Canada isn't just experiencing a cyclical recovery, it's deliberately using market conditions to make structural investments. The EV market surge, that 13 to 16% market share for zero-emission vehicles, is the visible manifestation of a deeper technology transition. And unlike the United States, where that transition is creating domestic conflict between legacy auto manufacturers and EV startups, Canada has positioned its traditional manufacturers to participate in both. Ford, GM, Stellantis, Honda, and Toyota all have significant EV production in Canada. But the real structural advantage lies in critical minerals and battery manufacturing. The Inflation Reduction Act requirements for U.S. content in battery materials create incentives for localized battery supply chains. Canada's mineral wealth and clean electricity make it a natural destination for that manufacturing. This is why GM's announced cathode facility in Canada matters, even if it's been somewhat delayed by tariff uncertainty. It represents recognition that North American battery supply chains need to extend beyond U.S. borders. Similarly, the Chinese EV imports, controversial as they are, serve a function in the Canadian market that goes beyond just price competition. They demonstrate that Canada's auto consumers can access technology that North American manufacturers are still ramping into production. If North American EVs become less competitive on price and features compared to Chinese alternatives, that creates a domestic political constituency for policies that encourage Chinese investment and manufacturing in Canada. This is how industrial policy works at the intersection of consumer preferences, investment decisions, and geopolitical positioning. The employment picture is complex. Through 2025, Unifor, the union representing workers at the Stellantis Windsor assembly plant, documented significant job losses. Around 3,000 workers were impacted at the Brampton assembly plant, with 1,200 more at the CAMI assembly plant in Ingersoll. The union leadership has been vocal in criticizing both the Trump tariffs and, more cautiously, the Canadian government's China deal. There's legitimate concern that opening Canada's market to Chinese EVs could accelerate the decline of traditional assembly employment if North American manufacturers can't compete on cost. This is the political pressure that explains why the Carney government's new automotive strategy includes worker support measures. But the flip side is that battery manufacturing and critical minerals extraction create different and potentially more stable employment than traditional automotive assembly. A lithium mine or a battery cathode factory employs fewer workers per dollar of output than a vehicle assembly plant, but the jobs tend to be more stable and less subject to offshore outsourcing. You can't move a lithium mine to Mexico. The Canadian government is essentially betting that transitioning employment from automotive assembly to upstream supply chain work is worth the short-term disruption. Looking at the broader geopolitical context, what's perhaps most significant is how Canada's choices affect North America as a whole. Mexico's automotive industry remains deeply integrated into North American supply chains and has been less aggressive about diversification. But if Canadian strategies prove successful, if the combination of critical minerals, battery manufacturing, and EV production creates genuine economic opportunities, then Mexico will face pressure to pursue similar strategies. And if both Canada and Mexico start building alternative trade relationships in Asia, the entire logic of North American manufacturing integration shifts. Suddenly, North America becomes less of an integrated unit and more of a contested space where individual countries are pursuing their own strategic interests. This brings us back to Washington's surprise. U.S. policymakers approach the tariff crisis with assumptions about leverage and dependency that are proving less durable than expected. They assumed that Canada, having no other options, would capitulate. Instead, Canada deliberately built alternatives. They assumed that North American integration was so deep that it couldn't be disrupted. Instead, Canada is deliberately introducing economic redundancy. They assumed that the auto industry would seek protection and subsidies to maintain the status quo. Instead, sophisticated manufacturers and suppliers are using the crisis to invest in next-generation technologies. The boom, such as it is, exists within this context of controlled crisis and strategic repositioning. Yes, sales are strong and exports are holding up. Yes, EVs are penetrating faster than in the U.S. Yes, critical minerals and battery manufacturing are attracting serious investment. But none of this is accidental. It's the result of deliberate government policy, industrial strategy, and recognition that the old North American integration is no longer tenable given the tariff regime and the political uncertainty it's created. As we look forward, the USMCA negotiation becomes crucial. Will Washington try to force renegotiation that locks in North American content and manufacturing dominance? Or will it recognize that Canada has genuine alternatives and negotiate accordingly? Canada's new strategy, with its emphasis on Chinese partnerships and Asian trade diversification, gives it plausible alternatives. It won't be able to completely decouple from North America. That's economically impossible. But it's no longer entirely dependent on the goodwill of Washington. The irony, and it's a substantial one, is that the Trump administration's tariffs may have accelerated precisely the outcome it claims to want. They wanted North American manufacturing. They got stronger incentives for North American battery manufacturing and critical minerals processing. They wanted to reduce Chinese influence on the continent. Instead, they've created conditions that pushed Canada toward Chinese partnerships. They wanted to rebuild American auto dominance. Instead, they've created enough economic pain that other countries are building alternatives. For the geopolitics of the 2020s, Canada's automotive industry boom, paradoxical as it seems amid tariff conflict, might represent one of the more significant repositionings. It's a story about how mid-sized powers respond to pressure from larger ones. It's about the difference between tactics and strategy. It's about recognizing when an old order is breaking and being willing to invest in alternatives rather than defending the past. The vehicles being built in Canadian plants today are the same brands as a decade ago: Ford, GM, Honda, Toyota, Stellantis. But the supply chains feeding those plants are changing. The downstream markets for those vehicles are expanding, and the government policy environment is deliberately structured to make Canada's automotive sector less dependent on the goodwill of Washington and more connected to global value chains. That's not a boom, that's a transformation.